Hello peeps, it's that time again. Time for another Metal Gear Solid examination. Today we turn our attention to a teeny tiny game known as Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty. Maybe you've heard of it. Unlike with my Twin Snakes analysis, as much as I would love to go into the same level of detail as I did in that video, I realised listening to me praise and drool over one of my favourite games of all time wouldn't exactly be the most compelling route to take. It's no secret that criticising stuff can often be a lot more fun and eye-opening compared to projects where you echo similar opinions that were already part of the consensus. In that regard, I'm not sure I have much to add that you probably haven't heard elsewhere, so I don't see any reason to make this thing any longer than it needs to be. I would, however, like to shed some light on why this game resonated with me so much, and how it influenced my perception of video games as an art form. Because yes, in the grand scheme of titles that I feel really push the boundaries as to what a video game can be, I rank Metal Gear Solid 2 among the best of them. We're talking not only games that have powerful stories and enjoyable gameplay, but the types of narratives that utilise the video game format to its fullest potential and could only ever be told through this medium. I think when most people talk about video games with a good story, usually titles like The Last of Us or Red Dead Redemption 2 will instantly come to mind. And understandably too. Those are two examples of great storytelling. But despite being well told, they're also fairly rudimentary and linear in comparison to... well, I think you can already guess where I'm going with this. Not that there's anything wrong with that per se, but I wouldn't consider them narratives that push the boundaries quite on the same level as something like, say, Silent Hill 2, or the subject of today's discussion, which don't just have an intriguing plot at face value for players to follow, but also provide a level of replayability for those who are enthralled enough and in search for the full picture. They are the types of games where you'll spot new details or interpret things differently on a second, third, fourth, or whatever playthrough you're on. Things that will both enhance the experience or leave you pondering into the night long after you've beaten the game. I consider this kind of storytelling to be more powerful because of that very reason. Still, to this very day, games like Metal Gear Solid 2 eat away at me and have been at the forefront of my mind for many years. I'm not sure I can extend that same level of praise over to The Last of Us or Red Dead Redemption 2, even though I can confidently say that I liked their stories. Hell, I'll admit, I even cried during them. Once I was done with those games though, the impact they had on me wasn't as long-lived as other contemporary titles. Spoiler alert, by the way, if you want to play this for yourself someday, then kindly get outta here and stop watching analysis videos that go in-depth on these types of subjects. When the intricacies and answers are spelled out to you in content like this, all it does is rob you of the magic you'd get from first-hand experience playing it. In short, quit consuming YouTube, grab a controller, and allow yourself to be transported into these strange and wonderful worlds that were created to entertain and communicate ideas to you. So there's your warning. The door's right there, get out. If the first Metal Gear Solid is the most nostalgic game from my childhood, and if Metal Gear Solid 3 is my overall favourite in the franchise, I would characterise Metal Gear Solid 2 as the single most important game I've ever played. It was like the gateway that gave me a whole new appreciation as to what video games can accomplish, extending even further beyond the craftsmanship that went into Metal Gear Solid 1, which, if you're not aware, was originally the game that gave me a taste, a sneak peek as to the potential this kind of format had, and some could argue opened the way for the types of storytelling we see today. It's because of Metal Gear Solid 2, though, that I began to notice thematic elements and how they are communicated within a story. Not to mention the more creative aspects, like how certain scenes are framed in order to draw attention to crucial plot points. And then we have the incredibly complicated subject matter itself, and the deeper ideas that are explored that really blew my mind when I was a teenager going into this for the very first time. I didn't know what to make of it on my initial playthrough, but what I can say is that despite any confusion I had with what I had witnessed, I was still somehow captivated from beginning to end. Asking a 12-year-old kid to understand all of the ins and outs and what it all meant by the time the credits rolled around is a pretty tall order. Hell, most adults trying out this thing for the first time today have no idea what to make of it. I feel like that for many who've given Metal Gear Solid 2 a whirl, deep down, you knew you had just experienced something truly special, even if you couldn't quite put your finger on why that was. And that's where the replay value comes into the equation, because you begin to spot snippets, tiny nuggets if you will, of details that went over your head the first time around, turning it into a giant puzzle box of sorts, one that becomes easier to piece together the longer you observe it for. And that's part of the charm with Metal Gear Solid 2. There's so much here to dig into, to figure out, to acknowledge and converse with others about. And so that's exactly what I've been doing ever since it captured my imagination all those years ago. Games like this one are rare to come by on the platform, with only a handful of titles out there that accomplish such insane feats. That's why I'm officially setting up a list that highlights these very special, yet finite number of games that go beyond what we imagined was possible when we think of storytelling. I'll kick things off with Metal Gear Solid 2, and over time, more of these wonderful pieces of art will be explored and added to the list. But first things first, let's have a good old chat about one that is near and dear to my heart. Allow me to set the scene. The original Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation was quite possibly one of the most popular and groundbreaking video games at the time. All the kids from around the block had played it, and furthermore, it was something that people had raved about for years. So naturally, when we were given even the slightest whiff of a potential sequel, we lost our shit. No, seriously. We were no longer able to control our bowels, and shit came shooting out of our asses over the mere prospect of being able to play as Snake again. I cannot stress enough how crazy the hype was for this thing. To put it into perspective, the current day equivalent of the excitement that was garnered back then was akin to Rockstar dropping a new Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead Redemption trailer. Gamers from all over the world were going berserk waiting for its release. And to top things off, Metal Gear Solid 2 was going to launch on the latest brand spanking new Sony console, the PlayStation 2. It's hard to find anyone who wasn't swayed by the E3 trailers or promotional material leading up to the big day. I even remember there being billboards. Yes, fucking billboards with the game's poster plastered all over them. The world was truly united in its craving to see this franchise continue. And when the release day finally arrived, the world's economy went into ruin due to the sheer number of people calling in sick for work. I obviously made that last part up, but I genuinely wouldn't be surprised if there had been a slight dip in the number of people showing up for work. It was also a rare example of a video game not only living up to expectations, but exceeding them in a multitude of ways. I couldn't believe that games were capable of pulling off the types of graphics and AI that had been presented within the trailers beforehand. And yet, here it was in the flesh, doing exactly all of those things it had promised and then some. It is a testament to the game's legacy that modern audiences playing through the series for the first time even now are blown away by the sheer level of polish and quality that was poured into it. But despite the universal praise, the accolades, and the influence Metal Gear Solid 2 had on gaming as a whole, it wasn't without its fair share of controversy and friction. And this, my friends, comes in the form of Raiden. You see, Hideo Kojima was not quite as forthcoming about the inclusion of a new protagonist throughout the promotion of the game. As a matter of fact, there was zero mention of Raiden at all. And when I say zero, I'm not kidding. There wasn't a single iota of info or hidden clues that may have subtly alluded to his presence. Nada. So as far as everybody else was concerned, we'd still be in the shoes of the much-loved and adored hero known as Solid Snake. Not only did this turn out to be false, at least for 3/4 of the adventure anyway, but he is confined to a supporting role via the codec in later stages. And to make things worse, there were often long stretches of the game where players weren't able to interact with him using the device. Suffice it to say, fans were none too pleased by this. That's where the aforementioned friction came into play. People no doubt still loved the game, even after learning of Raiden's significance to the script, but they couldn't help but consider him as a sort of blemish on an otherwise incredible sequel.
Disgusting.
And my word, is it a beast of a game. Just about everything that made the first title such a joy to play has been refined and expanded upon in Sons of Liberty. Remember how people reacted to the AI in the first one, and how mesmerized they were over guards noticing, say, Snake's footprints in the snow, or when they heard splashes coming from puddles whenever Snake stepped in them? That was impressive stuff back then. It's fair to say Metal Gear Solid 2 makes the AI in that game look like the slugs that first crawled out of the oceans and eventually turned into the human race. Metal Gear Solid 2 guards being the humans in this analogy, and Metal Gear Solid 1 guards being the... yeah, I think you get the point. Let's just say there was a noticeable upgrade.
I'm under attack! Stay alert!
Understood.
They wouldn't merely hear sounds or spot footprints coming from our character, but they actually observed environmental changes beyond that. Whether it be from cracked glass, magazines strewn about all over the floor, blood trails, you name it. And even though at face value the guards seem to have the same cone of vision as the game that came before it, no. In practice, they were far more aware of their surroundings than you might expect. For instance, if one of the enemies is at a higher altitude than the player, say 1 or 2 floors up, maybe higher, and you just so happen to be standing below them in plain view, depending on the difficulty you selected at the start, they'll come running the instant they see your outline. This is in stark contrast to the first game, where you could stand a couple of feet below a genome soldier, and they'll go about their day as though nothing is amiss. I don't know, perhaps you can excuse it by saying that the genome soldiers just weren't getting a decent enough salary. Regardless, they either couldn't see very far ahead, or they weren't paid enough to see far ahead. These guys, however, must clearly have wads of cash getting stuffed down their pants because they'll go above and beyond to spot you. Even when you're clearly outside their cone of vision, they'll become cautious anyway.
Who's there?
and check out what was standing outside their field of view only moments ago. It really ups the ante in terms of tension, and you often find yourself thinking outside the box in order to elude them. I'll go as far as to say this is some of the best AI I've seen from a video game in general. You only need to examine a single evasion sequence to understand why I would make that claim.
Encountered the enemy. Request backup.
Understood. On an additional unit sent to Strut F. Don't allow the enemy to escape.
Move! Clear!
The AI is just so juicy. I just want to lick it. Out of the two acts, the first being the tanker portion and the second being the plant section, I do find the tanker to be the more impressive of the two. The level design itself is borderline genius, but something about the atmosphere and the way that it takes place during a storm makes it stand out too. It really feels like the team behind it did everything they possibly could to impress and hook people in during this part, which is why, in comparison, the plant doesn't stand out as much. Not that I'm implying it's bad, mind you, but you could tell that the creativity and design sorta peaked in the earlier act. There's still quite a lot to appreciate about it despite these minor shortcomings though. One of which is the fun the crew clearly had making Easter eggs, which are as abundant as ever here as they are in the tanker.
What? I'm going to go in my pants. Nobody's looking, right?
Raiden, my sympathies. Sneaking missions are called wet works for a reason after all.
Don't worry about it, Jack. It's okay.
Rose?
That is, as long as you take a shower the second you get back. Do we have a deal?
Probably, yeah.
Speaking of which, I don't know if there's another franchise out there that features as many secrets as the Metal Gear Solid games do, especially when it comes to the second and third title. There are so many, as a matter of fact, that even now, I'm still stumbling into new ones I didn't even know existed. It's kinda mind-boggling how many there are.
What a weirdo.
Another thing I like about the plant section is the simplicity of it, and the familiarity with your surroundings that builds as you travel from strut to strut. The tanker was a bit more windy-windy with its maze-like structure, and initially, it was easy to become lost. But once you figured out your way around the place, it quickly became very satisfying. I think this kind of design would have been problematic if it had carried over to the plant though, and this is due to the area being much larger in scope, which may have led to frustration if it had been equally as complex for players to traverse. Thankfully, they kept it rather simple. So yeah, while it doesn't stand out as much, overall I do like what they managed to do with it. With that said, one piece of criticism I'd like to bring attention to is the pacing. On subsequent playthroughs, the opening portion of the plant can be a bit of a slog to sit through. And when I say sit, I'm not joking, since you won't even have your hand on the controller for the most part. This is where the game dumps so much information on the player, and unless you want to skip it all, you're kind of expected to just take it all in. Okay, it's the first cutscene, so of course it's allowed to be long. Let's just open this door and hopefully, hell yeah, some gameplay. Oh wait, no, a codec call. And another cutscene. Okay, cool, we get to play now. Aw yeah, I made it past the guards. This is so exciting, I can't wait to... Oh, it's the codec again. That's fine, surely we'll be able to do what we want soon. Yet again, the codec. Alright, sweet. Now this has to be the part where I get to play without any interruptions. Fucking never mind. What about now? Nope, god damn it. Are we safe? Of course not. Could we possibly go 3 minutes without the codec? I just want to play! As you can see, there's very little gameplay in between the cutscenes and codec conversations, and things only begin to open up once you reach Peter Stillman, who will tell you about bombs that have been planted on every strut. After that point, the game will ease up on the cutscenes and codec conversations for a while. Sadly, while I do enjoy the idea of finding bombs and preventing them from exploding, since it kinda feels like a game of hide and seek, but obviously on a far grander scale, it maybe goes on a bit too long for my liking. It would be fine if after taking care of the first 6 bombs, that was it. But as soon as you freeze the last one, you're expected to run all the way back to Peter's hangout spot to pick up an item he left for Raiden, only to then be presented with a new device to seek out bombs. This is where a timer emerges, because it seems a new explosive has been planted. So you run back to the start where you first infiltrated the big shell and take out the bomb there. Then afterward, you gotta go after yet another one located on the helipad, and so you run all the way over there, freeze it, and so begins a boss fight, where the gimmick is to dismantle bombs. Yeah, to say this becomes a little fatiguing is putting it lightly. Outside of the first 6 bombs, for me, this whole ordeal probably ranks up there as one of my least favorite things in the whole game. The other being the sequence underwater where you need to escort EE to Shell 1's core. Sorry, Stanley, I will be referring to her by that name from here on out.
Oh my god.
If you thought the bombs were bad, just wait until you have to babysit EE. Outside of the over-reliance on bombs to pad out the game and the aforementioned section with EE, there aren't too many complaints I can make about the rest of the experience. It's all pretty much top tier outside of those 2 specific parts, and mercifully, they take up less than an hour of gameplay combined. Metal Gear Solid 2 also marked the introduction of the M9 Tranquilizer pistol, a weapon that would slowly become detrimental to the franchise as more games got released. And you've already heard me make a fuss multiple times over about how it negatively affected the gameplay of such prestigious titles like Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes. Here though, it's implemented rather well. The layout of the levels are narrow and cramped compared to the design of, say, The Twin Snakes or Metal Gear Solid 4, meaning you'd often find yourself waiting for a window to jump out from behind cover and take shots at patrolling guards, or finding alternative methods of sneaking by. In these other games, however, more often than not, you could run straight into the middle of an open area and clear out an entire army of enemies without much resistance whatsoever. In essence, removing all of the obstacles from long range and then going about your merry way. It's part of why I feel more involved whenever I'm playing Metal Gear Solid 2, as though my actions have real consequences if I screw up, which isn't really the case with those other 2 previously mentioned games. It's like they only included the M9 to meet the criteria of what is expected in a Metal Gear Solid game, but they didn't reevaluate the design of the stages to reflect its inclusion, unlike with Metal Gear Solid 2, where the opposite is true. That game was built from the ground up with the M9 in mind, thus the devs made sure to keep things, whether we're talking about the levels themselves or enemy encounters, largely claustrophobic and at close proximity. There's a couple of exceptions to the rule dotted around, but the majority of your run-ins with guards will be well within their field of view, and this both increases the tension and challenge. So while the inclusion of such a weapon worked wonders for this game, it sadly began a long-running trend that soured some of the later titles. So yeah, now that we've got most of the major complaints out in the open, we can brush those to one side and get into the more juicy, succulent stuff. Basically, the parts of the game that make me insanely moist. I don't know why I decided to phrase it that way, but whatever. Let's just roll with it. That's why you should always stick to the script and don't try to ad-lib, especially if you're me. Because otherwise random nonsense will come slinging out of your voice box like with what happened just now. And now everyone's gonna think I'm weird, which I suppose is kinda true, but Still. I only have myself to blame. Jeez, maybe I get too excited describing Metal Gear Solid 2. Anyway, let's get back on track. Oh yeah, did you know? Metal Gear Solid 2 is filled with so many bugs. Here are like 20 of them.
Gross.
Real talk though, this may be one of the most polished AAA titles I've ever played. In the hundreds and hundreds of playthroughs I've done, I still have yet to spot any game-breaking issues. I mean, I'm sure bugs probably do exist somewhere, but they'd be the types of glitches you'd have to really search for. Going into MGS2 Vanilla, you just ain't gonna run into them. Also, can I just take a moment to shout out the VR missions in the Substance Edition? These tiny bite-sized challenges rarely get any kind of recognition, which is why I'd like to take a minute to give them the attention they deserve. They start off like a regular run-of-the-mill tutorial to help introduce you to the mechanics, reminiscent to the ones featured in the first game, so nothing too interesting. But as you complete them and open up new missions, they'll start to become more and more bonkers the deeper in you get. You'll eventually reach a point where you're actively pursuing spooky ghosts, evading building-sized Russian mercenaries, and there's even a skateboarding mode to boot. Yes, you heard that correctly. Fucking skateboarding. But it seems whenever I talk to anyone about their time with Metal Gear Solid 2, the impression I'm left with is that nobody played any of this stuff, or were at the very least put off by the first wave of tutorial-esque VR missions that they never made it to the more off-the-wall nutty stuff. Even those regular VR levels were quite fun to go through though, because they gave you the opportunity to try out things that you otherwise might not have in the main game, since making mistakes there can come with a hefty punishment, whereas here, due to the much smaller scale of the stages and the ease in which you can reset them, it means you can do so to your heart's content, thus encouraging players to experiment more than they would be willing to otherwise.
Nice work.
Overall, I've probably poured close to 70 to 100 hours into the VR alone, and I urge anyone watching this to give them a go. Believe me, you'll have so much fun. One of my favorite aspects about this game is Raiden himself, although admittedly, I wasn't the biggest fan of his around the time Sons of Liberty was released. Just like everybody else, I felt trolled and I couldn't understand why they'd replace somebody as iconic and memorable as Snake with this whiny crybaby rookie alternative who looked like he was ripped straight out of a Final Fantasy title. A character that would say incredible lines such as this.
There's a terminal in front of the elevator, a node.
Did you say nerd?
Or how about this?
We've managed to avoid drowning.
Good job.
Not nearly as cool as Snake's vast array of one-liners.
That takes care of the cremation.
Funny story, during this period, me and a group of buddies would refer to Raiden as Emotep, because The Mummy was still super popular around this time frame, and we thought of Raiden as somebody who had emo-like tendencies, and who was in our eyes at least, a villain that should be locked away in a coffin and placed somewhere out in the desert, left to rot for besmirching the Metal Gear name. Do I regret the jokes we used to make? No, not really. But I've reached the place now where I'm able to appreciate what Raiden represents thematically in the overall story, and how it felt as though Hideo Kojima was critiquing us on what we wanted from a sequel. Did we want to play the exact same game again, or something new and fresh? The whole experience almost comes across as a scathing attack on sequels in general, and helped us to reevaluate our priorities. Because when you think about it, Metal Gear Solid 2 is a repeat of the first game, a complete recycle of those events. It had a similar set of antagonists with special abilities, another Metal Gear unit for us to battle against, the codec, Claymore mines, pooping guards, even more codec, and a deep story for players to follow. The only difference is that our character isn't quite the same. But even that isn't quite true, is it? Nearer the end, Raiden's backstory is explained in full detail, and it turns out his upbringing is just as tragic and depressing as Snake's, if not more so, shedding new light, a new perspective on the way he acted and how he behaved up until this point. So what were people complaining about? Metal Gear Solid 2 offered everything the PlayStation Classic did, and then some, including when it came to the main protagonist. That's just part of the genius with this game. It was under the disguise of something new, yet underneath that cloak was Metal Gear Solid 1 again. The ultimate Kojima troll, giving us exactly what we wanted, but presenting it in a way that made us feel like we'd been deceived. So yeah, I do get the impression that Raiden was purposely written to be unlikable in the early stages of the script, but nearer the climax, after the game presents background context as to why he seems slightly off and not quite all there, because of his childhood trauma and how he often tries to forget about the past. Most players end up sympathizing with the inner torment he's struggling to overcome, and generally agree there's much more to him than meets the eye. The Raiden that pops up in Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots is the real Emotep. My God, did they butcher his character in that game, but that's for another video.
Whatever.
Another aspect that I love about Metal Gear Solid 2 is that whenever I replay it, I'm able to piece together all the clues and foreshadowings that reveal what's truly going on. Because boy howdy does it explore some strange and funky territory. It's one of the few experiences where you can feel the world collapsing in on itself, making you question what is real and unreal. Because you see, as it turns out, everything Raiden has taken part in, his accomplishments, his failures, the people he met, information that was learned, all of it was staged by an ever-present nebulous organization known simply as the Patriots. Or another name they go by is, you know what? Lead away, Scotty.
The Lale Lule Lo. How's that possible?
That one doesn't quite roll off the tongue as easily, does it? Their plan was to conduct a ginormous exercise for Raiden, or experiment if you will, to figure out if they can manipulate and mess with a person enough to shape them into something else. Whether that be by changing their viewpoints, their fears, their habits, or pretty much anything you can think of. If you can warp someone's mind and sense of reality enough, you can change them into just about anything. Not to get too philosophical, but this is a truly scary thought, and we can actually see examples of this working in everyday life. Even from the get-go, when we're born into this world, our parents or guardians are pumping ideas and beliefs into our minds. And when you are a child, because your brain is still developing, you don't have the ability to push back on certain opinions because kids simply don't have the life experience to know if something they are taught is problematic or wrong. It means many of us are indoctrinated into certain mindsets that we may not have picked up if we were under the guidance of someone more neutral when it came to certain topics. Like how many of our beliefs are truly our own, or were merely things that got passed down to us, and we got so desensitized into believing them that they remain imprinted on our minds until the day we die. Metal Gear Solid 2 proposes this idea on a whole nother level, and suggests that adults, as well as entire societies, can be shaped in a similar fashion. If a shady Illuminati-like entity that controlled the world could censor specific information and only pump stuff out that benefited them, how quickly would we see changes in our everyday lives? Humans are fairly easy to manipulate after all. You only need to take a quick glance at any political content creator on Twitch or YouTube to notice that. We aren't necessarily truth-seeking machines as much as we like to think we are. Since we have a tendency to carry the biases that were taught from childhood into our adult lives, most of us will generally stick to our small bubbles, afraid of a larger forum. Only watching popular influencers or looking at online sources, we've either cherry-picked or were duped into believing somehow. And these places will then proceed to feed us information that reaffirms our own preconceptions that were likely passed down to us by someone else from our early years. It's probably happening right now as we speak. I'm sure some of you clicked on this video to have me reaffirm your beliefs on why Metal Gear Solid 2 is a great game, and have been nodding along to everything I've been saying up until now. It's a weird feeling knowing you've been outed, isn't it? This examination of the game could have gone in an entirely separate direction, however, where I purposely rewrote the script to convince those watching that Metal Gear Solid 2 wasn't as good as people say it is. I could have tricked you into clicking on the video with the promise of a positive review, whether it be due to a catchy title I used in the description or a visually striking thumbnail, only to then dish out nothing but criticisms I had on the game. And depending on how charismatic and believable I was, it's possible I could have changed your mind on it entirely, or misled unsuspecting newcomers to the series that haven't played it for themselves yet, and convinced them it wasn't worth a damn, even though I was dumping out misleading info that may not have necessarily been true. It's mind-boggling how gullible we often are. I mean, an example of this is the perception that Hideo Kojima predicted the future when he wrote Metal Gear Solid 2, and how this entire speech from the Colonel and Rose, or I should say the Patriots AI, came to fruition years down the line. But what if I told you he didn't predict the future at all, and that he was merely pointing out the types of behaviors that were already becoming prominent on many online platforms? It's no secret that the internet, while indeed still in its infancy, was definitely around and being used by many during the late 90s. I feel like somebody in Kojima's position would have been either aware or even familiar with it at this stage, and it's likely he would have been using it when writing the script for Metal Gear Solid 2. And through his interactions within this cyberspace, it's entirely conceivable he observed the tendencies communities already had in this wild, wild west known as the internet, and wanted to draw attention to it. Obviously, I can't substantiate any of this stuff. Not unless I spoke to Hideo Kojima himself and asked him directly. But I suspect that a lot of this stuff was happening even back then, and he was one of the few people to acknowledge it. Whether he predicted something or he didn't, it doesn't change how thought-provoking the final product is. It's because of this game that I no longer stick to single communities, or only go to one source to receive gossip or news regarding world events. I've now taken strides to step out of my comfort zone and look at everything as a whole. The thing is though, and this is the truly unsettling part, did I come to that conclusion on my own? Or did Metal Gear Solid 2 shape me to be this way?